I'm Kara Infante, and this is Bookish Flights. In each episode, I chat with one bookish guest as we take some time to sample and savor the pairing recommendations from their bookish flight. We hope to give you suggestions to cultivate your TBR list and nurture your leisure time through books. In today's episode, I am chatting with Paul Attaway. Paul was born and raised in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Paul attended Georgetown University and graduated from the University of Georgia School of Law. He and his wife then moved to Phoenix, Arizona, where Paul embarked on a 30-year business career before retiring to pursue fiction. Paul and his wife relocated to Charleston, South Carolina after raising 3 children in Phoenix. Blood in the Low Country is Paul's debut novel. Writing this book, along with the move to Charleston, is a coming home of sorts, a return to the South. The history and culture of America's South is rich, complicated, at times comical, sad, tragic, uplifting, and inspiring. Welcome to the show, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are?
Well, let's see here. I think that almost changes daily. In that kind of depends upon what role you're playing. We all have lots of roles. So on a recurring basis, I've been happily married for 35 plus years. New to the slate of job titles is granddad. So we have 2 grandchildren.
Congratulations.
And thank you. That's a lot of fun. And a new project that I have is I'm now a walking history tour guide in Charleston.
Oh, cool.
So I've been doing this since about February. So I get to give walking tours of a city. If you've never been to Charleston, it is America's most well-preserved city. We have homes here dating back to the early 1700s, and the city is just overwhelmed with the history. And so that's sort of my newest title, the Walking History Tour Guide.
And what a way to learn about the place you live. How long have you been in Charleston now?
We've been visiting since 2010.
Okay.
One of our daughters was a freshman here at College of Charleston, and we joked that when she graduated in 2014, she left, but Mom and I moved in and we stayed. So we've been visiting since 2010. And 3 years ago, we sold our house in Phoenix and we moved here permanently.
Okay. We're a Navy family, actually. So I have a few friends that are stationed there. So if they wanted to do this walking tour, how would they find you?
Well, you have my contact information.
Okay.
Just pass it on
right.
and have them email me and we can take care of the rest.
Awesome. Okay. Well, and then listeners, we'll maybe put how you could contact Paul in the show notes as well, if that's your neck of the woods and you're interested. Because we move a lot too, that would be such a great way to learn about the new place you move or live.
It is.
Yeah.
I get a chance to learn daily, ask questions by the people in my tours. And the ones I don't know, I go home that afternoon and I find the answer. So I'm armed next time in case somebody asks the same question.
Yeah. Do you create the tour yourself then?
Yes and no.
Okay.
But at the end of the day, the tour is laid out here. We walk by where the Revolutionary War began. Not where it began, but where the first naval battle was here in our harbor. Of course, Fort Sumter, kickoff the Civil War was here. Some of the earliest colonial settlers were here. So we just walk by all the historical spots. I don't have to create anything. I just have to lead them by.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the story tells itself a bit.
The story is there for us to discover and tell.
Well, that is really cool. Well, since we're already into stories and essentially some writing of sorts, whether it's a verbal or on a page, why don't you tell us a little bit about your debut novel?
Blood in the Low Country. This book came out a few years ago, and it was exactly that. It was the first novel I'd ever written. And I had a 30-plus year career in the business world. And my wife and I, we became empty nesters. And I was too young to retire, but I was too exhausted to start any new businesses. And so I became a consultant. And it was somewhat satisfying. But I was between consulting gigs. And, I was mouthing off. I had just finished a book. I would say something like, what a fantastic book. Or I finish a book and I go, that's not very good. I could do better than that. So my wife and I joked that she said, Paul, I'm getting a little sick and tired of hearing you say you could write a book. Either do it or move on. So I said, fine. So I decided I was going to try to write a book. So I read lots of books on how to write books and lots of blogs and really immerse myself in that. And then, some of the advice you receive is, write what you know. So I began, making notes. What is it that I have, intricate knowledge with? Blah, 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 blah. And so I ended up with a stack of legal pads this high of just notes and ideas.
Wow.
And so we were here in Charleston visiting. We had a place to stay for a period of time. And I walked to this library I sat down and I began to literally a blank sheet, began to try to write. And it was intimidating. And I had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
Long story short, we had recently been introduced to a couple, and they were a little bit older than us, and they had fully retired. And he had been a film editor, and he knew a bit about storytelling. He had spent a lot of time in writing rooms. And he came back and he says, Paul, quit trying to write a book. Just write. Just write. Write whatever pops into your head. Just write, and then you'll write a scene.
Okay.
And then before you know it, you'll write another scene, and then you just sort of stitch them together. Well, this was the basic philosophy that I employed as I started out. And then it's hard to explain it. I just really got into it.
Yeah.
And I ended up, writing a story. And my basic initial idea was that I could write about fathers and sons.
Okay.
And so I wanted to have, a father-son, some tension there. And my father's passed away a long time ago, but we had a great relationship. So that was underlying the story. But I'm writing along, and at some point I realized, well, this is really boring. No one wants to read this story. So I go, someone's got to die. So, we killed one of the characters, and now we have a mystery. So the story really just began, to unfold. And I, had these characters, and then I really worked hard at ensuring that the characters reacted in a way that was consistent with their character to the all the stuff that I threw at them. And before you know it, we had a book that was written.
Wow.
The book is a family drama. It's set in Charleston. You could describe it as Southern fiction.
Okay.
You could describe it as a little bit of a murder mystery. There's some suspense thriller in it, but it involves a family here in Charleston in the 1970s. There is a murder in their community that turns the lives of a couple of families upside down. And then we see how this family reacts and how all the characters change over the course of the book as they deal with the tragedy that's in their lives.
Wow. So as you were talking, and let's go back a little bit here, and you were talking about sitting down with the blank page and be like, I'm going to write a book. But then I imagine that is just seems like an overwhelming goal, right? When you're like, I have a blank page I'm starting, and this is going to be a book. How is that going to happen?
Right.
And they talk about habit formation, right? And breaking it down into smaller pieces. And it sounds like that's exactly what you did.
Yes. Well, there's the old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, and there's a lot of truth to that. And, I developed habits in my work career in terms of, when I do my best work, how I like to work, how I like to tackle problems. And I like research. I like problem solving. I like that. So that really is what it became. It became a matter of, okay, how do I do this? What is character arc? How do I affect character arc? What's a subplot? Well, I know what a subplot is, but how do you write one? And so I would write, and then I'd kind of get to a point where I'd go, okay, I'm kind of lost in the woods here. I got to find my way out. And I might then stop and spend several days just Googling and reading blogs and articles on subplot, on how to write a bad guy, on how to write a fight scene, on things like that. And so then I'd jump back in, and that might carry me the next several chapters. And it really that was really how I had to tackle it.
Yeah.
And then the book does get done, and then you begin the editing process. And so I'm the people who are professional writers have been doing this whole career. No doubt they have the ability to sit down and see the story from beginning to end.
Sure.
They outline it and they write it. And maybe I'll get to that point someday, but right now my writing is very much jump in and kind of see where it goes.
Okay. Yeah, that was what I was going to ask you is if, as you're doing these small chunks, right, or one bite of an elephant at the time, did you have an idea of how you wanted the story to go, or did the scenes that you were writing each day just really take that arc of the story?
The Even that was an unfolding process. I can't tell you when, but I did get to the point where I knew it was going to happen.
Okay.
I had the last scene. I had the last scene in my head,
Okay.
and I had a couple of plot twist inflection points where I knew, okay, this is going to happen here, and that's going to change the direction of the story. So I had a couple of those, whatever wording you want to use, tent posts, etc.,
Sure.
that were going to drive the story. But then I had to write and get myself there.
Yeah.
And so I did know how it was going to end.
Okay.
Now, in terms of in my first book, the very last chapter in the book, it's sort of the climax happens in the second to last chapter, and we have this one last chapter. Well, it was a scene that I had written that I really liked, and I initially had it about halfway into the book.
Okay.
It was sort of some character revelation, and I liked the scene, and I get towards the end and I go, you know what, that scene belongs at the end of the book. This character, blah blah blah. So anyway, the very last chapter of the book was a scene I'd written early on. I got to figure out where to put this, and so it ended up working best actually at the end of the book.
Okay. So when you get to that scene or what you initially had as the final scene, is that how in this writing process you know the book is done? You're like, okay, this is done. I can leave it.
Yeah, it was done. I knew when it was done.
Okay.
I knew when it was done.
Yeah. I have not written a book myself, so I'm like, how do you in your mind know when, okay, yep, that's it. I'm done writing.
That's it. Right.
Letting it go.
Yeah, we know. Yeah, we know who the killer is, or everybody's character flaws have been revealed or resolved, or highlighted in some way.
Okay. In your career in business, did you do a lot of writing?
I did a lot of writing.
Okay.
I was an attorney for 2 years, so it hardly counts. I was in law school longer than I was an attorney, and of course, that's pretty much all you do is read and write.
Yeah.
And then after that, I was a small business guy. I started about 3 different businesses, and so I wrote everything. I wrote our marketing material, installation manuals, PR releases, letters to investors, communications with vendors. I mean, I wrote, disclosure documents for offering memorandums. I mean, I wrote everything. So the craft of writing, in terms, I had been working on, since I got out of law school.
Yeah.
And in the business world, well, frankly, throughout much of life, the shorter the better. The shorter the better.
Sure.
I really worked to try to keep my communications with whatever my audience was as short as possible. 1 page, 2 pages. I mean, just really short. So that writing in and of itself was not foreign to me.
Okay.
Now fiction writing is a little different, but still, at the end of the day, I'm more in dialogue is different. Writing dialogue is different, but in terms of the omniscient voice, I'm probably more of a short sentence descriptive type of writer.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So what did you learn about yourself in this writing process for the book? Let's say for the book.
I'm not really sure if I learned anything about myself. Well, I learned I could write a book. But I think the biggest, I'll call it a learning moment, or I'd say more of a risk, is, I told all my, once the book was done and I was moving towards publication, like, I didn't tell anybody I was writing a book.
Okay.
I mean, I told a few people. Then it got to a point where I know I'm going to finish this book. And then I began to tell more people. Well, it gets to a point then where you're publishing your book and it's available for purchase. And of course, you want to tell everybody. And so I had a lot of friends who basically, they said, I was afraid to read your book. I go, why? And they go, well, I didn't know what to say to you if your book was awful. So you really put yourself out there. And I kind of like, I got to get that.
Yeah.
So I said, no, go ahead and read it. I can handle it. And I was very happy. I came back and they're like, oh, good grief, I really liked your book. So my older, closer friends were like, I can't believe you wrote a book. And I'm like, why do I always hear that? So you do take a risk
Yeah.
when you all of a sudden, I mean, no one knows what, I mean, we know what people do for business, but you don't actually, see their work product
Sure.
necessarily. Or it just, and all of a sudden you write a book and you're out there.
Yeah.
And yeah, and so I would say it's a very it can be risky. And I'm really glad I took the risk. Um, and and if the book had bombed, no big deal.
Yeah.
They'd still be friends. But that was probably the biggest fear, so to speak, was everyone's going to read this book.
Yeah.
Not I say that, not everyone, of course, but a lot of your friends are going to read this book.
Yep.
Yeah, what happens then?
Yeah, I imagine there's a lot of vulnerability in that moment, right?
Yeah. Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You stick it out there and you go, okay, hope they like it.
Yeah, I'm exposing myself a little bit. I hope the
Mhm.
outcome's going to be good.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so and then in this process, so do you now have a writing habit? Do you write daily? What does that look like for you?
No. I would say, I'm not a professional
Sure.
writer. I'm not a writer. I say I'm a storyteller.
Okay.
And I'm learning the craft of writing. Now, that being said, when I get into it, when I commit myself to, okay, we're writing the next book, I then have a process, and I will write not every day, but I would say I'm writing 5 to 6 days a
Sure.
week, and I do most of my writing early in the morning. And my goal is 2,000 words, 1,500 words a day, and I do have these, or it'll be write this scene, solve this problem. How does this character move from here? So I would say I'm fairly disciplined once I'm into the actual story,
Okay.
and I know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So, but when I'm between books, for instance, for the last 6 to 7 months, I have been really focused on learning American history and learning the history in Charleston. So I've been reading primarily nonfiction books about the Civil War and the colonial times. And I give 2 2-hour walking tours a day.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it's like, okay, I gotta find that time to write. So that means getting at the desk at 5 in the morning. So I've got my book 3 over here, and I'm pointing at it over here, and it is about 75% formulated up here, and I've got my executive summary of what the story is going to be. And my wife and I have been traveling for a while, but we got back this week, and so I'm like, okay, it's time.
Yeah.
I need to go all in, because I can't write a book a little bit here, a little bit there. I tried that.
Okay.
I can't do it. I have to fully commit to it,
Yeah.
and then I can get it done.
Yeah. And I imagine though with your traveling, right, you've been able to now you said formulate it so much in your head, you've been able to really give it a
Right.
lot of thought and give it some time there. So it'll be ready to go out on the page
Yes,
when you sit
yes.
down.
Yeah. So I've got probably about 15,000 words written, but
Okay.
I need to really it needs to become priority 1A
Okay.
right now.
So where
So
is book two then?
book 2 came out a little over a year ago,
Okay.
and it's called Eli's Redemption.
Okay.
And without giving away too much, it's a sequel to book 1.
Okay.
I wrote it as a standalone. I really I wrote it in such a way that if you hadn't read the first book,
Perfect.
you would not be totally lost.
Okay.
But if you had read the first book, it would pick right up, and you would go, wow, okay, so this is what happened. And so in the first book, we meet 2 boys, and they are in high school when we first meet them. They're brothers, Walker and Eli. And so without giving away the plot twist, etc., one of the questions people had for me after they read my first book was, well, what happened to Eli?
Okay.
What happened to Eli? And so I go, and at some point in the writing of the first book, I got to a confidence level that I'm like, okay, I can do this. And I started getting the idea that, okay, I could write a series. And so I went back, in the editing process and planted a thing or two here or there.
Okay.
And so the second book answers those questions. When people go, what happened to Eli? The second book answers those questions.
Okay.
And so now these two boys, as the series will advance, become young men with families living in Charleston. And my series is, again, Southern fiction, these two young men now living in Charleston. And because of the rich history in this part of our country, my books are always, I say always, hopefully, my future books are going to involve at times a flashback of sorts to where some part of the history of Charleston is not dredged up but pops up again and impacts lives of people living during current times. So
I love that.
sort of drawing and these two characters, one is going to be a rock star chef. We have some wonderful chefs here in Charleston. The other one's going to be kind of the attorney, estate planner with a whole host of dysfunctional clients. So that's where hopefully the series is going to go.
Yeah, this is why I love reading, because I'm learning at the same time too, right? I might be learning about Charleston or a historical event in Charleston where I'm sure I learned all these things back in school.
Right. Yeah.
But until they're put into a story like this, it's like they haven't, they don't start taking up space.
Right. So yeah, exactly. So the in my second book, half of it takes place in Charleston and half of it takes place in the Bahamas.
Okay.
And there has been a long connection between Charleston and the Bahamas. I could bore you with some history, but during the Revolutionary War, people that were living in the colonies, about 20% of our country's population at the time were loyal to King George. And they left the colonies during the Revolutionary War, figuring they'd just turn right around and come back after the Brits had won.
Okay.
Well, of course, it didn't work out that way. But there were about 5,000 loyalists who fled the southern colonies and ended up in the Bahamas.
Huh.
So there's always been a connection between the Southeast and the Bahamas in terms of loyalists who fled the colonies and then set up. And there are still those family names that you can trace back to the colonies. And that's how they ended up in the Bahamas.
Wow. Cool.
Yeah. So there's all sorts. Yeah, exactly. I think it's cool too. I'm glad somebody else does.
So I had literally no idea. I've been to Charleston, and I didn't do a walking tour though. Maybe that would have helped. So
it's amazing what you can learn.
Yes.
That's right.
But that's actually what we try to do. Our kids are younger. They're 8, 5, 3. So when we travel, we do try to do the walking tours, because then we can have the stroller and the little one might just fall asleep on the walk.
Fall asleep.
That is our mode of trying to explore cities for sure.
Very good.
So, well, let's switch gears a little bit and let's talk about who you are as a reader. So have you always been a reader?
The answer is yes and no.
Okay.
Again, in terms of reading fiction, no. I didn't really start reading fiction until I've stopped being a lawyer. Up until then, I had been a constant reader, but it wasn't fiction.
Sure.
And I say that to say I was a high school and college debater, and we read and researched constantly. And then law school, it's all you do is read. And then as a lawyer, all I did was read. There was no time for fiction. There was no interest in reading fiction. I had a little bit of an interest. Obviously, school, English classes, and read all the assigned reading, but it really wasn't my thing. And then we had young kids, and then they get to a point where they don't take all of your energy raising them. And my wife had always been a reader. It happens. Trust me, it does. It does. There's this brief little window, and then they become teenagers. My wife had always been a reader.
Okay.
And so then I just sort of started, okay. And then, so I became a reader of fiction. I would probably say it wasn't until my late 20s that I started to, 30, that I began really to have the time. And then where I began to make the time. And then, my wife and I, for birthdays, all we did was buy the other one books. It was like between holidays and Valentine's and anniversaries, after a while, you sort of the gift giving becomes you can't do it 4 times a year for 30 years. So we would just buy each other books.
Yeah.
And that worked great. And then the Kindle was invented. And for a while we're like, well, I'm not going to buy you a book because there's no satisfaction
Yeah.
in, sending you a book.
Popping an
But
ebook in
now,
there.
yeah, popping an ebook. So we've kind of moved through our Kindle stage and we're back to reading books. And so we're now back to buying each other books for our
Yeah,
birthdays.
you should see my husband's nightstand, actually. I laugh as
Yeah.
you're saying this because I'll hear about in doing this show, right? I'll hear about books that because we read differently, I'll hear about books. Oh my gosh, he would love that book. And there are times because his life is busy too, and he doesn't always want to pick up a book in the evenings, which, to each his own. I'm like, okay, his stack's getting a little obsessive over there on the nightstand.
Right.
Maybe the next holiday I need to get him some clothes or something.
Get them close, right? Yeah, and it used to be you could buy each other CDs, but you can't buy CDs
Yeah.
anymore. So yes, books and music used to be our constant gifts, and now we're back, but just to books. We don't have a CD player.
Yes,
So,
yeah, because books,
yeah.
I feel like, because you hear them and you think of the person, right? So
Right,
there
right.
can be so much more than like, oh, I just saw this on the shelf. I thought I'd grab it for you. It's like, no, I think
Yeah.
I handpicked this because I think it would fit you.
I think you would like
Yeah,
it, right?
yeah, awesome. Well, what type of genres do you enjoy to read?
Again, that is changing. And I'm reading more and more different genres now. When I first began to read, it was Michener, John Grisham. It was, all of the suspense thrillers, etc. I can't even think of all the other names. So, Born Identity, that whole series. And I now don't read quite as much of that type as I used to. I'm reading more historical fiction, and I still like the suspense thriller. Daniel Silva, his books all around Gabriel Allon. Gabriel Allon is one of my favorite literary characters. Great
Yeah.
character. Mossad, espionage spy master, whose cover is as an international art restorer. So those are great books. I don't know that I'm so much a fan of a genre as I am fans of an author.
Okay.
And if I like the author, I'll go back and I'll try to read, everything they've done. James Lee Burke, he would be considered Southern fiction. Most of his books take place in the Louisiana area. He's got a character that the books take place in Texas. He's got some that occur in Montana. My favorites are the ones that occur in the New Orleans area. Ian McEwan. He's an extraordinarily gifted writer, and his books are all one-offs. He's always tackling some issue or something interesting. So I'm more of an author reader than I am a genre reader. I do like the classic, private detective story, but I won't. But at some point, you read a couple and you go, okay, I need a break.
Yeah.
And then I'll go pick up nonfiction, and I'll go pick up a book on the Civil War, and I'll read that.
Yeah. I almost think of those as like palate cleansers a little bit. Like you
Yeah,
still
exactly.
love that
Right.
genre. And
Right.
I sometimes feel like I get there with World War II historical fiction.
Okay.
Like I'm like, okay,
Yep.
all right. I love
need a
these.
break.
Every time I read them, I really
Right.
enjoy them. But like
Yeah.
you need the break. You need to switch
You
out.
need the break. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Like Harlan Coben, I really like his books. One of the recurring themes in his books that it seems like he writes very well about suburban parents and threats that happen to your children. Well, if you're a parent and you read a book about some horrible crime that's been committed on someone's child, there's nothing scarier.
Yeah.
And so I'll read the book and I'll go, okay, that was great, but I need a break.
Yeah.
I'm going to go read some nuclear war suspense thriller, book, something that's light,
Yeah.
anything other than someone's child being kidnapped.
Yeah. And seems so far away from,
Yes. From reality. Yeah. But so like Harlan Coben is a tremendous storyteller. I like his books, but after I read one, I need a break.
Okay. You have brought for us 3 books that you've been reading lately.
Yeah.
So can you tell us what's the first one today that you brought?
It's called Rhapsody.
Okay.
And Mitchell James Kaplan.
Okay.
And it's historical fiction. And but it's more historical than fiction. And the dialogue is fictionalized, but it is the story of a woman who was married to Paul Wahlberg, who was one of the wealthiest banking families in the world at the outbreak of World War I, and his father had helped form the Federal Reserve here in the United States.
Okay.
And she was a skilled, trained classical musician. And she was sort of born in the poor part of town and ends up marrying this extraordinarily wealthy, powerful man. But the real story is she became the long-term mistress of George Gershwin. And so it's really the story of their love affair. But you read the story and you learn a lot about George Gershwin and his brother Ira, and what a genius Gershwin was, but at the same time, kind of what a selfish, childlike man he was. Because I think that sort of happens when you're a genius in any
Yeah.
field. You start to see the world through the eyes as if you were constantly 5 years old. How does this affect me? How does this affect me? And then if you are musically inclined, you would love this book, because it goes to a great deal of detail about how Gershwin was such a radical jumping point off of Strauss and all the 19th century, Austrian musical geniuses, Mozart and all these guys. And he comes along, and he's this improvisational genius. It's fascinating, and I'm personally fascinated by that time period of history when so many of the people in our country were new immigrants, and World War One breaks out, and there's the question as to where their loyalties lie. Are they Americans, or are they Germans, or are they British, and where do their loyalties lie? And the cultural changes that were happening. It really, I thought it was an excellent example of historical fiction. I really enjoyed it.
Wonderful. I've never heard of this one.
Yeah.
I've played the piano for many years though, so I feel like this would be right up my alley.
Yes. So Rhapsody.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, because I'm trying to think. I've read somewhere like music is the center of the book. But the one I'm thinking of recently was Brendan Slocum. I think The Violin Conspiracy. Have you read?
Yes, I haven't read it, but I can see the book cover.
Yeah, and it's not
Yes.
it's not historical fiction. It's like more suspense, thriller, genre fiction. But thank you for sharing that one.
Yeah.
What is the second book of the pairing?
This is totally out of the blue, and I'm not done yet. This is one I'm reading on a Kindle.
Okay.
Dracula, Bram Stoker.
I'm reading it right now too.
Oh, you're kidding. Oh no, very funny. My wife and I, we just got back from a backroads trip. We'd never done one before, and the trip, we floated down the Danube River, and so by night we floated and slept on the boat, and during the day we rode bikes.
Okay.
And we were in the Czech Republic, Germany, Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary.
Nice.
And so we look for books when we're traveling someplace. We go, oh, is there some great work of fiction that was set there?
Yep.
So I'm like, okay, Transylvania used to be part of Hungary. It's now part of Romania. I'm going to read Dracula.
Yeah.
So I started reading Dracula, and I read it on my Kindle. And I think I'm about 80% of the way through, and they're hunting Dracula.
Okay, so you're a little bit further. I'm probably maybe 30%, 30,
okay.
Yeah, of the way.
Yeah, through. I won't run it for you. But one of the things I found interesting was in the story, the Count of Dracula, he has a hold on the minds of other deranged people.
Yes.
And there is there is an insane asylum in London, and the many of the inmates, so to speak, of the lunatic asylum, what they call it the lunatic asylum, are under his control. Now, this might sound crazy, but I remember watching one of the Halloween movies, with what was
Michael
Myers, right? And he's in an insane asylum, and he has the same control. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, that's a ripoff of Dracula.
Yeah.
And so many of our modern day horror characters I think they stole that particular feature from Bram Stoker's book.
Yeah.
Uh, so I'm reading Dracula.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I have a book club of friends because we move a lot and so we meet virtually. Actually, one lives in Charleston now. And none of us live local to one another, but we decided we wanted to like horror. I just I because I read at night. I
right.
don't like reading horror because I want to sleep
Yeah,
at night. Um,
I'm not really a fan of the genre either.
yeah.
But
So we were
go
like,
ahead.
but let's maybe Dracula, it's a classic.
Yeah,
Maybe it won't be like the blood and the gore and
right.
and so, but every time I go back and read one of these classics, I think in my mind I've always thought, oh, they're so unreadable because I remember them being so dry
Yeah,
and being a young teenager and just maybe not just understanding life, right? Of being able to really dig
right.
into the story. And every time I go back and read a classic, I'm like, gosh, this is way more readable than I would have ever thought.
Yeah, the it is. They tended to use very long
Yeah.
sentences, very long sentences. And the dialogue is, of course, very different. It's much more romanticized than our dialogue today. But I would concur with you. I'm enjoying the book more than I expected to,
Yeah.
in reading
And
it.
especially when you go, well, you have it on the Kindle.
Yeah,
I bought a hard copy
yeah.
book and I'm like, this
Oh, do
thing
you?
is thick.
It is. It is. Yeah. And I kind of one of those. I'm reading. I'm screening along. Wow, this is a really long book.
Yeah.
So
I
yeah.
think it's almost 500 pages in the print
Is it?
form on the on the book. So I'm like, when I got it, I'm like, okay, hopefully this is going to be a
All
good one
right.
because I'm going to spend a lot
Yeah.
of time with this.
I'm reading it. Yep.
Okay, and then what is the last book you're reading?
I am this one I read a while ago. And the author's name is Tana
Oh
French,
yeah. Okay.
and she's Irish. And I think I've read now three or four of her books.
Yeah.
This one was called The Searcher, and it's a retired cop from Chicago who is, he's divorced, he's got an adult child, and he just sort of on a whim picks this tiny little rural town in Ireland and he moves to. But and there's a character in the book, a child, teenage level, that he ends up kind of befriending. He's acting in a way towards this vagabond type child in this small village in a way that I think he ends up having a relationship with this child that he wishes he had with his now adult daughter who's still living back in the States. But he's a cop by nature. That's just his nature. So he begins to investigate a crime around town, and he begins poking his nose into the lives of some people, and he's the outsider. She, her books I would say are difficult to describe, and I mean that in a good
Yeah.
way. She's a very gifted writer. She writes stories with compelling characters. I really like her books. I don't know really how to describe them. She's just a very good writer. So that was the last book that I read. More of a literary fiction, a lot of character depth. You learn a lot about the characters, and the changes they go through are very, very subtle. They're very subtle character arcs. They're not like hit you over the head. Da-da,
Yeah.
the big change, right?
Yeah. I read the first book. I can't think of the name of the series right now by her.
Is it the female police detective
Yes.
in Dublin?
Yes.
Yeah, I've read a couple. I forget her
I
name
know it's
too.
skipping my mind right
Yeah,
now.
I've read a couple of them, and I like them.
Yeah.
They're good. Yeah. So um and they're written in such a way that some of the Irish colloquialisms, there's enough there. You're reading characters that are Irish that are living in Dublin, but it's not so thick and heavy that as an American, that it goes over me.
Yeah.
So I enjoy reading them from that perspective, and I'm aware that they have an Irish brogue. I'm aware of that, but it's not too thick. You're able to read the books.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you for sharing that book flight today of the books that you've been reading lately. That is really fun. And we've got the full gamut here, right? Of a historical
Mhm.
fiction to a classic. To,
Yeah, romantic horror story, I guess.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that is great. How I love to end the show here is what I call our bonus pairings, which are just a speed round of questions. So we can just
Okay.
answer these really
Sure.
quick. Where is
Yep.
your favorite place to read?
Here now today we have a screened-in porch in the back of the house,
Nice.
and that's my favorite place to read.
Lovely. And what's the winters get like in Charleston? Are they pretty
Eh,
mild or?
yeah, I'd say they're mild.
Okay.
A cold winter day is 45 degrees and misty rain,
Okay.
but you can also get 65 degrees and bright sun.
Yeah.
So they're mild, but they're not necessarily predictable. You could get a great week, you followed up by a cold week.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So I was just wondering if you could get out there year round.
Yeah. Yeah, you can. But there are times of the year that I would travel here over other times of the year.
Okay. All right. And then what is one book you have read that has changed your life?
Um, okay, there is not a fiction book that I've read that has
Sure.
changed my life, but there just isn't one. So um I'm a I would say I'm not a churchgoer, but I'm a follower of Christ.
Yeah.
So I would have to answer that question with the Bible
Yeah.
is the one book that I've read that has changed my life. But in terms of fiction, there's some books I've really loved. I go, wow, that was a great book,
Yeah.
but it didn't change my life.
Yeah. And the
Yeah.
Bible, you could read it every single day of your life and you're still going to get something from it.
Yeah. That's the
Yeah.
genius of it. Depending on where you are in life, the parables will take on a whole new meaning
Yeah.
for you.
Yeah. It's amazing. And then are you a rereader?
Yeah, I knew that question was coming, and my first response was no, I don't reread. And then I go, wait, well, I did read that. Well, I did. So there's like a half a dozen books that I've reread.
Okay.
Uh, a Separate Piece, John Knowles, a book that I read when I was, I don't know, ninth grade, 10th grade.
Okay.
And that was probably the first book that I read that was assigned to me that I go, wow, that was a great book. So I reread it a few years ago. Again, loved the book. It's a World War II era book. Boys at an all boys prep school.
Okay.
They're ready to grow up, become men, and go to war. Great book. John Knowles wrote other books, and so I went back and I read more of what he wrote. He was known for A Separate Piece. It was a runaway bestseller, continues to sell.
Okay.
His other stories are great. I reread that one. Um, um, Golf in the Kingdom is a cult book by a guy named Michael Murphy. And if you
Okay.
have any golfers that listen to this show, they go, yeah, I know that book. Um, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, Ken Casey.
Yeah.
I reread that book a couple of years ago. Sort of the anti-hero. I was trying to write an anti-hero character,
Okay.
so I went back and I read, that book. One of my all-time favorite movies and a really great book.
Yeah.
So those are a couple that I've reread.
Okay. Wonderful. Thank you for sharing those.
Yeah.
And then last question here. What are you reading next? Well, I know you're going to finish Dracula.
Yeah,
But
I got to finish
yeah.
Dracula. I've got a couple. I'm going to jump back into some history. I've got a 3 volume set on the Civil War. Each volume is like about this.
Wow.
I read a couple this summer. I called this summer the summer of the tome.
Okay.
I read all of these, all these. I read this book on European history because we were going to Central and Eastern Europe, and it was like this. So I've got volume 1 of this trilogy on the Civil War that I'm going to read. But again, that's a book that I can't just sit down and read all the way through.
Yeah.
I need a break. So actually, I just purchased. It should arrive hopefully today. The River We Remember.
Yes.
William Kruger. I'm not
Kruger.
sure how to pronounce Kruger. He wrote This Tender Land,
Yeah.
which I read a couple of years ago,
Yep.
maybe last summer. Um, really liked that book. So I
Yeah.
purchased that one.
He was on
You know,
I had him on the show
oh,
episode.
did you?
Yeah, so you can
Yeah,
listen. It's
yeah,
out. It came out on
yeah.
September 6th. I can't remember the
Excellent.
episode number though, but we talked a
Yeah.
bit about
This
that
Tender Land, great
yeah, and
book.
the river we remember
Yeah.
because it came out after it released. So we had talked
Okay.
about
So
that too.
I've got that one coming in. And then Grisham's book, the sequel to The Firm, which he wrote
Okay. Yeah.
25 years. I think it's called The Exchange.
Oh.
That book, I'm not sure if it's coming out in I'm not sure if I'm receiving it tomorrow or if I'm receiving it in a few weeks, but I know it's coming out.
Okay. I didn't know that he
So
was
I've got
coming out with a sequel. I'll have to pay
yeah, it's a
attention to that.
sequel. Yeah, I mean, I stopped reading Grisham religiously probably 10 years ago. I don't know, but they're safe books,
Yeah.
great characters. I'm not one to criticize a guy that's sold as many copies as he has. I often feel like his books stumble across the finish line. They're great characters, great storylines. I just sort of feel like sometimes they just sort of kind of fizzle out. You just
Yeah.
sort of finish it. You're like,
Okay.
okay. But The Firm was a great
Yeah.
book. And so this is the sequel written 30
I
years later,
know.
whatever it
Okay.
is. So I'm like, okay, I'll read that one.
Yeah.
So those are the next books I have coming up.
Wonderful. All right, Paul, why don't you tell us how we can find you?
Oh, it's quite simple. PaulAttaway.com. Paul, Paul, last name is Attaway. And there you can learn about my books, how to buy them, where to buy them. And if you're in Charleston and you're looking for a tour, you can reach out to me there as well.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I know your time is precious, so I appreciate all that you've given me today.
Absolutely. Thank you.
You are so welcome. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today with Paul Attaway. You can find all about the books talked on this episode and his book flight at bookishflights.com. That is also where you can find more information on today's flight and any other books that we talked about today. I want to inspire a community of readers. So whenever you share a post about what you are reading or what you are picking up next, especially if you have heard about the book on the show, please tag us. Follow us on Facebook or Instagram at Bookish Flights. This is a brand new show, so if you enjoyed it, please head over to Apple Podcasts and give the show a review. Your review not only helps me, but it also helps the show reach others. Make sure you are subscribed on Apple Podcasts or Spotify to make sure that you will not miss an episode. That's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. As Emma Thompson said, I think books are like people in the sense that they'll turn up in your life when you most need them. Cheers to you, dear readers. Until next time.